Professional cyclists really do live the dream. Their whole life revolves around riding the bike. But it's not all glamorous as it seems. For pros, training isn't simply a hobby, but a job, a way of life. The biggest difference between the average Joe and the pro cyclist is that a pro cyclist doesn't have to worry about going to work or the stress about squeezing their training around other commitments. Training always comes first, and that is why it is so difficult to match what they do. So with that all said, just how do pro cyclists train? Professional cyclists cover an awful lot of kilometers throughout the year, especially in the winter months. It's common to see rides up to 6 hours in duration on the training plan, and they're usually covering anywhere between 15 and 30 hours on the bike per week. In the past, training was all about volume, but in the previous 2 decades, it started to get a bad name, with many claiming junk miles had no place in a modern plan. As a time-poor amateur, you'd be silly to spend all your training hours in Zone 2, but as pros have so much time at their disposal, they can afford to spend the majority of their time riding easier and further, which helps build this huge aerobic base. You know, when you watch the top pros put out incredible power figures at the end of a race, and that foundation is one of the reasons why they're able to do that. So if you're training 6 hours a day, how do you fuel yourself? Many people don't think about nutrition when talking about training, but it's arguably the biggest limiting factor. Imagine a race car without fuel. The same theory applies for cycling training. In fact, it's common to see pro riders consume hundreds or even thousands of calories while they're riding. Of course, athletes fuel with training in mind. For example, they'll have meals higher in carbohydrates before key sessions, or decrease their carbohydrate intake in an easier block. On top of this, they take their fueling on the bike very seriously. During endurance rides, it is expected that you'll eat 60 grams of carbs per hour, or even more. As training increases in intensity, carbohydrate intake does too. That said, there are countless different training techniques out there, and each one has its pros and cons based on the individual and their circumstances. For many pro riders, it's polarized training that works best. Polarized training divides training into lower intensity and higher intensity work, and mostly avoids training in this sort of tempo zone 3 range. Around 80% of workouts are completed at this lower intensity and 20% at this higher intensity. Each micro training cycle, maybe a day or 3 or a week block, will be tailored with varying levels of intensity to fit in with the different goals at different times of the year. And that's where periodization comes in. Periodization is what allows the pros to peak exactly when they need to. A pro cyclist year doesn't start on January 1st, but at the start of November. Between November and February, the focus is building up and preparing for the race season. Most pros will have 2, if not 3 training camps in this time period, where the aim is to gel together as a team and build a base for more intense training yet to come. Between March and October is the race season. While every rider has different targets depending on their role in the team, it is expected that they'll have at least 3 peaks per season. A peak usually doesn't last too long and is highly focused around an individual race or a small number of races. After the season ends in October, most riders will take between 2 and 4 weeks completely off the bike to have both a physical and mental break before starting again. When we lay out the season like that, you can understand why pros have to periodize their training. It's pointless being the best in the world in January simply to be the strongest on training camp. Similarly, it's impossible to expect a rider to be in peak form all the way from March to October, which is why they know how to rest. There's a great saying in cycling: why stand when you can sit? Why sit when you can lie down? You'd be surprised how many pros take that to heart. The biggest difference between you and I and a professional cyclist is the percentage of the day that is spent prioritizing recovery. I'd say, rather ironically, some of the laziest people that I've ever met are pro athletes. Pros know how to take recovery seriously. If their training plan says to ride easy, they will ride very, very easy. If their training plan says to take a recovery day, then you won't find them doing much apart from putting up their feet. I can't even begin to think how many times I've seen amateurs go on rest days, but still sprint for that town sign or push up a hill. Resting is the silver bullet that means pro cyclists will always be this one step ahead of us mere mortals. When I was racing professionally, my favorite way to train was the old school method, with heart rate and by feel. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to a power meter for a majority of my career. What I liked about the way I trained was that you had to listen to your own body and feel the power you produced. You had to recognize the signs when your heart rate didn't react the way you expected. I think if people were able to replicate that with a power meter and a training plan, then it'd be hugely beneficial. The biggest thing that changed in my training after I stopped racing professionally was that I took more rest days. This simply allowed me to go harder on the bike when I rode. With work and general life issues that pop up, I couldn't commit to the same amount of time on the bike as before. However, I've always tried to maintain an element of structure. I think this is where a lot of people go wrong. If you ride consistently, you will benefit from structure. I hope this quick insight into how pro cyclists train was helpful. I've got plenty of stories from my time as a pro, and I'd be happy to dive into that more in a future video. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested to see. For now, thanks very much for watching.